Hey, welcome to the Ethics Experts. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. And if you're a returning subscriber, hey, bestie, your smile lights up the room. You see what happens when you subscribe, you get a bonus greeting on every episode. On this episode, we talked to Laura Sauber of Sauber Consulting. She runs a consulting practice for healthcare organizations, and she wrote this really cool article on Medium about reimagining compliance programs. So we dive deep on how to better engage with the business, how to reframe your program to leadership, and how to really move away from this compliance only organization or this compliance only approach to one that is more inclusive and holistic by changing the behaviors and building that culture of integrity. Hope you enjoy it.
Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
Hey, Laura.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How you doing?
Good, thank you.
Welcome to the Ethics Experts. How's your day going so far?
It's going great. I've had a lot of interesting conversations already this morning.
Already, huh? Well, it sounds like the bar is high for me today, huh? So thanks so much for sending over that article. That was a really great article. I'd love to kind of just dive into that.
Sure, absolutely.
So, the article sort of discusses how ethics and compliance programs need to move from, mere sort of like regulatory checklist exercises to strategic drivers of organizational integrity, and goes on to talk about, the kind of strategic impacts of what that kind of a culture can have in the organization. So What kind of drove you to write this? Because I think it's, it should be sort of tattooed on everyone's like eyelids or something. Like it's the conversation we need to be having,
It is. I even toyed with, how to title it and I named it Reframing Ethics and Compliance Programs. But ultimately, I think we need to rebrand ethics and compliance.
Right.
Every time I hear the work we do referred to as compliance programs, I kind of cringe inside.
Right.
Because I think it's the lowest level of value that these programs provide. And so in my experience, and the reason I even went into it is because it's all about culture. The being compliant part is really just the outcome of having executed on a compliance program, an ethics and compliance program.
So to the extent that, so I'd like to first diagnose this compliance problem. And I want to talk about what you just said, or this branding problem. And I want to talk a little bit about what you said, that essentially what you said is like, when you have the right culture, compliance is sort of the outcome. It's like, It sort of takes care of itself, or it's the sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of that kind of a culture. Do you think there's any relation to the fact that we were focusing on outcomes many times that we can't control, that has contributed to this branding problem that we've been trying to sort of break free from?
Yeah. Yes. So when you're in a culture where it hasn't been paid attention to, you end up being exactly what people fear of compliance, right? Because you have to, even with the most friendly compliance officers, at the end of the day, you're trying to help move the culture, to help clarify the accountability in the organization so you can actually solve the problems. So
do you think that it was a lack of foresight in terms of no one individual sort of controls how an industry evolves, but the collective decisions on how individual programs evolve sort of aggregate into what that industry's sort of life cycle and path is, right? Mm-hmm. We're all making these individual decisions about how we roll out training or what our code of conduct looks like. And that ends up creating sort of a broad impression of what compliance is and so forth. Obviously, the name compliance existed before compliance departments existed. So there's some sort of connotation that's attached to that word. But I'm just trying to kind of diagnose and kind of pick apart this branding issue, because it's a real issue. Everyone talks about it. Everyone who's forward thinking, at least, who's trying to really kind of revolutionize their programs and really authentically build these cultures of integrity, they're trying to shake free of this moniker or this kind of stereotype. Mm-hmm. And so do you think it's just kind of a natural thing that has happened given the nature of the role? Was it an inevitability that this kind of a branding problem issue exists, given that, hey, it's about at least in its infancy, it was about finding regulations and seeing how those overlap with our operations and putting rules in place to prevent wrongdoing. Like, is the branding problem just a natural outcropping of how compliance naturally emerged from the primordial kind of like business soup? Or do you think there are things that we should not have done or could have done differently that could have made the branding problem deconstruction that many of us are trying to do, that your article was addressing, a little bit easier now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the history of it led toward this branding problem. I think sometimes what we mistake is we're looking for compliant organizations, but I don't necessarily want compliant people, right? Like in the sense of not thinking on their own,
right.
Raising issues, bringing forward different types of thinking. And I think sometimes we confuse that we're talking about creating an ethical organization. And so, I've been in conversations where you're talking ethics and leaders kind of cringe, right? Like, and it's like, I had a leader say to me recently, well, but we're really ethical leaders. Well, I'm not talking about you as individuals. It's about how does the organization show up with integrity and ethically, right? And that's where it's a set of systems and infrastructure that has to be put in place to make it happen.
Right. Yeah, I like that distinction. What did you say? You're not looking for compliant organizations, you're looking for ethical organizations. The difference being that if an organization is highly compliant, they are at some level potentially relegated by whatever words are on whatever pages for policies and procedures. And what you're saying is, well, an ethical organization kind of transcends the limitations that the thing I just described presents, because business is changing and opportunities present themselves. And we want someone to be able to seize those opportunities, in pursuit of the organization's mission, but do that in an ethical way where they can almost infer what compliant behavior would be for something that's not been sort of discussed yet.
Yes, exactly. So much of it is helping individuals understand the concepts that and the values and behaviors that we're looking for. It's not in the weeds what the regulation says, right? Because you'll never get everyone to, especially in an industry like healthcare, which is so regulated. You want people to know enough to ask the question and to go looking for that answer. So
I'd love to talk about your experience in healthcare and how those experiences that you've had led to you writing this article about reimagining ethics and compliance programs, right? Like at some point you were not in ethics and compliance, and then you got into it. And then now at some point later, you've had these experiences and you're like, man, I got to write an article. I have to get this sort of message out. So what was it that you experienced that were kind of some catalysts or some building blocks for, you to hit that tipping point where now you've birthed this article for the world?
Multiple, but I originally went into it because of significant misconduct in an organization, and you could feel it in the culture that something was going on. You didn't know exactly what, and at the time I was not doing compliance work. But it just so happened that's when we started with our first compliance officer. She brought me on board to build the program. And it was because of the culture piece that I went into it, because I wanted to be part of aligning the values of the organization to helping the organization to actually live those values. And then there's other situations where I have seen systemic compliance issues over years, right? Never getting really fixed. And what it takes to get it fixed is actually engaging employees, having them be part of the solution. And often they're dealing with really painful workflows, right?
Yeah.
And so the value add that I, as a compliance officer, brought was helping to bring those issues forward, getting them actually resolved, getting the organization to invest in getting those things resolved that actually make life easier for the employees, much less getting us to a place that the regulator was happy with, right?
Right. So yeah. So I have like two questions, so I'm going to try to ask one at a time. Many times it seems, you kind of touched on something where the pain of the process that was sort of imposed on folks was causing non-compliance. It's very easy to have, it's easy to arrive at like the wrong conclusion for like the root cause of the non-compliance and say, oh, it's an ethics issue, or nobody cares. I'm the only person who cares in this. I'm the only person who gets ethics in the organization. How can we like advise listeners who are in a similar position to properly or more accurately diagnose that root cause, whether it's a true sort of culture, behavior problem, or whether it's merely workflows or processes in place that are like too cumbersome, that just people are just like, I can't do this. This is not like realistic. How do we diagnose that like in an accurate way,
Well, a lot of times it's multiple of those, right? When processes start to fall apart, you also have a leadership issue, right? An accountability issue. If nobody feels accountable for an end-to-end process, then
right, it's a jump ball. Nobody owns it.
Right, exactly. Honestly, the people that I've worked with who have embraced the compliance program and pulled us in early, they tend to be the highest performers in the organization. So,
okay, interesting.
Yeah, they're leaders that are respected by their people, right? They're actually cleaning up their operations, and they're not afraid to find out something's not working. So there can be a big difference, and you can tell if things have broken down, you likely have a leadership issue.
Okay, so that's a good rule of thumb. So let me ask you this: have there been instances where like these misaligned expectations between departments lead to compliance challenges? Like in terms of an expectation, like I'd love to kind of talk about some things like that. And maybe those are expectations about what the role of compliance is. Maybe that's expectations about themselves in terms of like what their job is. And maybe those things aren't accurate. But I've just found that in life and in work, most sort of conflicts are really miscommunications. There's some miscommunication. There's some assumption in place that's maybe without basis. And so if you've experienced something like that, maybe we can talk about some instances of that and how we can get out ahead of it. Because I think broadly, our industry is kind of at this tipping point. It seems like we're stepping into a new era. It seems like we're kind of in a new chapter where there's a lot of new potential for us to really bend the curve on culture of integrity. Like, again, 30 years ago, the average employee wasn't, on their hierarchy of what they were looking for. Culture of integrity was in a much lower spot than it is now. I think that we can all agree that that's sort of moved up. So I would love to kind of talk about that and how we can more quickly and more proactively, get out ahead of, compliance challenges that are rooted in these sort of miscommunications or these misaligned expectations, say.
Yeah. I mean, that's really where cross-functional engagement comes in. And, some organizations are highly siloed, and they're going to likely, in my experience more issues.
Right.
And so a key role that a compliance program can play is to help bring those players together. Spend time talking about, the areas where the one hand has to know what the other hand is doing. Am I making a change that's going to have a downstream impact to other departments, and begin to create that awareness and a sense of accountability across the board. And that really means, as a compliance officer, getting in and being willing to understand the operations. Getting in there with operations, talking through how things actually operate, right? And problem solving together. I think
Do you think that that's like a muscle that can be built, or do you think that some people are just wired for that? Some people I talk to are very kind of, I call them outside people. They're kind of getting out of their office. They're walking through the hallways. They're connecting with people. Other people, their kind of preference is to kind of be inside people. They're spending time behind in their desk, in their room, in their office. Do you think it's like, is it a wiring thing? Is it something that, if we're kind of an inside person, we just have to force ourselves to get out there? Like, how do we, like, you throw a pebble in a pond, there's ripples, and we know that those go across and they hit all the banks of the pond. Like, obviously, when you make a change into an organization, there's all kinds of ripple effects. So how do we get better at like thinking about the second and third order impacts of what we're trying to roll out, and maybe like underwrite that or de-risk that rollout in a better way?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's the individual, definitely. But also I think it depends on how they think about what we do. And I think more traditional views would have the compliance officer sitting at their desk, behind the door. So I think it's part of the shift that we need to make.
So how do we help people do that faster? Is it a confidence thing, you think? Is it just kind of some self-reflecting time to say, like, where is my program stuck, or where am I being effective? Because, I've been talking about this on like every podcast for, I don't know, the last month. I was at this conference recently, and Pat Harned from ECI was presenting some findings. And basically what she showed were data points from between 2023 and 2013. And the percent of respondents to the survey, the Global Business Survey, or Global Business and Ethics Survey, whatever it's called, respondents to the survey who answered, I work in a high integrity organization. It was that kind of a question. And so over the last 13 years, call it, the percent respondents have bounced between 60 and 61%. Between 60 and 61%, it stayed exactly in that band across the last 13 years. And when she presented the information, you could feel the energy in the room kind of go down. And I mean, to me, that seems like a massive opportunity, but at the same time, it's also shines a bright light on the fact that like what got us here isn't going to get us there. If we keep doing what we're doing, well, then it's going to be another 13 years, and that line's going to just stay at 60, and we are going to be, apart from the business. We will sort of turn into this barnacle on the ship or the bumper sticker on the car instead of the thing that makes the vehicle go faster. So talk to me about that and how we actually start to bend that curve, because I think just like the stereotype was built up by a bunch of individual interactions that sort of amalgamated into this, broad, thing that we're, this branding issue that you alluded to. I think any change in the direction of our industry is also going to come from a bunch of individual decisions and individual programs on how we as practitioners sort of show up with the business every day.
Yeah. I mean, I think it starts with us and how we think about it and how we educate our leaders about what our programs are about. Because I can't tell you how many job descriptions I've looked at, and they want a lawyer. Well, that means that they're only thinking about it from a compliance legal perspective, right? And so I think that to me says the organization doesn't understand fully what a compliance officer, their capabilities should be.
Yeah, what they can do or what their potential is. Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly.
So you mentioned in your so we're talking about leaders a little bit, and so what do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions that leaders have about ethics and compliance programs? So Ethico is the company I'm with. We just put out this survey with FTI, and it said that like less than or more than a third of respondents said that their leadership does not understand ethics and compliance, which to me is mind-boggling. Like 100% of respondents would say that they understand marketing, or they understand sales, or they understand ops, right? Like, how is this function that has all of this potential? Like, how are those light bulbs still not on at the top? What are the types of misconceptions that you see over and over again?
That it's only about the compliance piece is the biggest part of it, and that that role of a compliance officer is really more about enforcement.
Right.
And I think, that is not how we want to lead, and it's certainly not how we're going to engage the workforce and the culture in a positive way. Yeah,
it's got to be the carrot and the stick. It can't just be the stick, to your point.
Yeah, exactly. And organizational cultures vary, and to think that it's all on the compliance officer is not, it clearly is not the answer, because it really takes that partnership. And I've recently developed a maturity model that I've been using with clients. And really, it's not just assessing the compliance program itself, but looking at the business engagement, right? So it takes both those pieces. You could have a really capable compliance officer in a culture that just, hopefully over time they're able to influence. But, cultures are bigger than us individually.
Right. So I'd love to hear some more about that maturity model. Like, what went into the development of it, and what insights has that helped you uncover with clients?
Yeah, so I've been in my consulting practice for a year now, and I've used it a few different times. And it really starts with the obvious reactive compliance, ad hoc, moves into the the rules-based compliance to functional compliance, and then it keeps going up until 5 levels. Which the 5th level is much more aspirational, of course, but I've used it in a few different ways. One is it helps leaders understand what it looks like when they're engaged, right? So I was able to use it with a client that's been around a long time, and I think a few light bulbs turned on to see how their engagement may be impacting the success of their compliance program. And then also, I'm able to use it. I've been working with healthcare startups and really helping them understand, I don't put the when I do the assessment, don't necessarily put the target at functional compliance, right, for them, because they're a startup, right? So it gives me a way of setting a target for them that seems reasonable. And then they feel like they're building toward at least getting to functional compliance, right? With a company that's been around a long time, I'm going to have higher expectations around where they should be. So, and so it's a combination of both understanding the culture through survey, through interviews, and then also obviously their documentation and what they can represent as part of their program.
And I would just imagine, I say that like you're never going to just randomly wander to the top of a mountain. You're never going to wander to a 5-star compliance program.
Exactly.
Like, so much of what we experience is a function of the extent to which we had some vision for something in the past. And I would imagine that your model is really helpful because regardless of where somebody is at, if they're at stage 1 or 2, whatever, there are subsequent stages that they can put their eyes on and say, okay, well, once I build to this next level, I should start to see these kinds of characteristics or these kinds of behaviors or these kinds of outcomes. And you can start to be a little bit more intentional because, like, by its nature, it's a very hard job. You know what I'm saying? Like, and sometimes you don't have a lot of power. Sometimes you have leadership that doesn't understand you. You might not have the budget. I've never talked to a compliance person who has the budget that they want, that they feel like is reasonable, whatever. So there's all these headwinds and there's all these skills that you have to build to be like really effective. It's not just knowing the regulations, but it's also, to your point, knowing the business and being persuasive and being influential and all these, this bouquet of skills that are necessary to really drive initiatives forward. It's a very difficult and complex complex process that I think, and then by its nature, there's just stuff pouring in all the time. There's just all else equal, we're just going to be reactive. All else equal, the importance is sort of determined by us, by our own values and what we think is most crucial. Urgency seems to be like an external force that is like acting upon us. And like as fires are popping up, or as there's smoke, and as there's, emergencies and all that kind of stuff, that's a high level of urgency that ends up in many cases dictating how we spend our time. Would you agree with that kind of that kind of an angle?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so how do we break out of that reactionary mode? Is it just literally, I got to schedule some kind of deep work time to focus on the important non-urgent things that I know are super necessary? Like, I just find a lot of folks are, they come to our webinars, or they listen to podcasts, or they go to conferences, and they leave those sessions being like, yeah, this is awesome. And they get back to work, and it's like, man, I got a freaking massive to-do list. There's a bunch of new cases that have shown up, and these ideas that I have to improve, they just kind of get further and further down on my to-do list. So how do we ensure that we're pushing our program forward? You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's easy to get quickly overwhelmed, and it's really, even in those fires, how are you responding to them, right? So the building the trust to be able to do the things that we want to be able to do is happening now in those things that you're dealing with. So I think the best way to do it is, one, obviously it's going to take time, and then two, it's in the things that you're engaged with, even the fires right now. How are you approaching those? How are you interacting with the business to build that trust, which is ultimately going to give you the credibility, and hopefully at some point in the future, some additional resources that may be needed.
So, I mean, at some level, we're talking about like a branding issue, and with respect to this branding issue, it's really just what you're kind of describing is like, you have to change your reputation, or you have to take ownership of that reputation. And that reputation is really, again, an accumulation of a bunch of data points, a bunch of different interactions, and a bunch of those feelings that people have and the perception that they have of you. I kind of view every single one of those interactions, to your point, as an opportunity to change the direction or deconstruct the stereotype, the misconceived stereotype they might have of us. How do we keep the intentionality in those interactions? Do you know what I'm saying? Because sometimes it's like a freaking fire, and I'm speaking about myself. Like, sometimes I feel like it's a fire, and I probably don't show up in the right way because I got to put out this freaking fire. How do we maintain that sort of? I don't want to necessarily call it a calm, because urgency is critical, but how do we maintain space in our mind, or real estate in our mind, to ensure that we take as big advantage as possible of all those interactions that happen, every day, every week?
I think as I've been out on my own, some of my, perspective has shifted, and as I've gotten out of the corporate environment, but I think it's important to actually take a breath to figure out, is this really that urgent? Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's easy as a compliance officer to get really worried about the level of risk. And I've been guilty of probably being too worried about some things that aren't actually going to, at least not in the immediate future, create massive risk for the organization. So there's something to calibrating your level of concern over the level of risk.
That's super smart. Yeah. I've found that we sometimes struggle with materiality or expected value thinking, right? Like, something could be a massive risk, and if this happens, this is going to wreck our business. But to your point, if there's a 0.2% chance that happens, well, then do we really need to spend this much time on that as something that, so that expected value thinking is difficult. I think that's a great habit, to just kind of question and not just react, but to say okay, what should my reaction be? I think that's good advice. I'd love to hear a little bit about what made you go out on your own. That was probably a very scary thing to do, huh?
It was. I was looking for jobs at first, and quite frankly, I got frustrated because I'm not an attorney. And I kept seeing job descriptions that wanted an attorney, despite the fact that I had been an executive for, almost 20 years. And I realized that if I go out on my own, I'm able to actually do this and share with organizations and educate organizations in the way that I want to be able to do it. And the other thing was, personally, I tend to do what scares me. So
That's a great quality. That's a really great quality. Yeah.
so I decided to do it, and it has been the most fulfilling journey. It has been a very spiritual journey, to say the least. After having spent 30 years in the corporate environment, it's a very different path, and you get to know yourself in a way that you just don't when you're in-house.
Why do you think that is? Why is that such a revelation, doing a process like this? Like, why do you think it causes you to know yourself at such a deeper level?
Because there's no one to blame.
It's just you,
to, gripe about. It's just you. And any baggage you have to sort through in order to stay with it. Otherwise, you end up running back to finding a steady paycheck.
Yeah, there's like nowhere to hide in a one-man show. You know what I mean? It's like just you up there.
Yeah, exactly. And because of that journey, I'm actually starting a new community.
Cool.
Called Catalyst Her, and it's for women who are taking this route, going independent consulting. And the Her stands for Healthcare Entrepreneurship and Reinvention, because you definitely reinvent yourself.
Yeah. What have you found? So it was a scary thing. You're wired to do scary things. So you had some idea that this was going to be hard. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
In what ways was it harder than you thought? Like in what, I'll give you an example. I was training, a year plus ago for an Ironman race, and I was like, this is going to be really hard. And it was really hard, but it was hard in some ways that I didn't anticipate. I was sore with muscles I didn't know I had or something like that. So what are some of those corollaries on your entrepreneurial journey where you're like, I knew that this was going to be hard, but this part is really hard?
Yeah. First experiences. So I've been going to conferences, all my career. And yet the very first conference that I went to representing myself, I had a panic attack.
Yeah.
Suddenly it was very different, right? And so there's a lot of first in a different context than what you have done before. And so finding a support system. So that's where, as I was going through it, I found other women who were doing this as well. And we would meet every week. And going through a journey together is what helps. You don't have, most people think, oh, I can do that, I'd miss people, but you actually don't have to miss people. You just need to find your community.
Yeah. And I think another benefit of having that community is sometimes you're going through something where you feel like you're hitting a wall. I'll speak for myself. Sometimes I'm hitting a wall and I'm just like, well, I knew it. I knew I can't do this. When in actuality, everybody has to hit that wall, and everyone everyone who's successful overcomes it. And so just hearing that there are maybe people that are a little bit further down that path, or hearing that the challenge I'm facing is not unique to Nick, but rather it's unique to the path that I'm on. For me, it always gives me like a shot in the arm, or a new level of motivation to overcome that impediment. Have you found that same kind of a thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, they've been the people that I call when I am having that panic attack, although fortunately I think I'm beyond that, but
good for you.
But really, and just the basic how do I do this? I've been a compliance officer. I haven't done marketing and sales, and it's easy to put a lot of pressure on yourself, but it all works out. Just keep taking a step forward.
Yeah, you just have to have that sort of forward progress. So when you zoom out of what you're doing right now, how would you sort of talk about your angle? You went out on your own. Of course, there was the frustration that you mentioned, but nobody goes out on their own unless they feel like they have something to add. And so if you have something to add, you probably saw some gap in the marketplace, or some gap in the approach to building compliance programs that you're like, man, I can really help with this. What is that thing, or what are those things that you think when you go, that you think kind of differentiate you in terms of your approach, and or what are the types of things that what are the levers that you're typically pulling first that you have seen have the biggest impact on the outcome?
I think it is the understanding how to really engage with the business in a way that is, not sitting behind a door, and helping them understand how their behaviors contribute to the culture that we're ultimately trying to build, and being able to actually articulate that cultural piece of it. Because I know with one client, I turned a corner when I was able to really lay out for them in a document, here's what the behaviors look like. This is how I can tell where you're at on this spectrum, because of that experience that I've had firsthand as a compliance officer.
And what were some of those behaviors that you were keying in on or that you were presenting that caused that light bulb moment to occur?
It was about their in this particular instance, there was a repeated attempts at establishing a compliance program, right? And so breaking down what it looks like when managers or leadership actually engage, whether it's talking about it, whether it's the fact that they maybe didn't have a consistent resource around this, and also employees even understanding how to report something, right? So being able to bring those pieces in place to say, okay, now I can see it tangibly. I know tangibly what this is supposed to look like.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess at some level, it's kind of like you're sort of training the eye. I love cooking shows, and one of the chefs on one of the shows was talking about like a cook's or a chef's palate and how it's important to develop, and it is a muscle that you can develop. And I think to some degree, when you can teach someone what to look for, they now have a new skill and they can start to look at the world in a bit of a different way.
Yeah.
So that's probably very valuable to be able to say, hey, if the thing is successful, I should start to see these behaviors. Given that I'm seeing these behaviors, I know that you're at this stage on this maturity, model. And the next layer of things that I should see are X, Y, and Z. That again, right. Many times I just, what they say, like if you're caught in an avalanche, you should spit so you can figure out which way is up and dig the other way. You know what I mean? Or dig out. So much of it is just kind of figuring out where you're at. I just see a lot of a lot of, at least at the executive level, I see a lot of folks who are like, all right, well, I guess we need a compliance program. Let's launch one. And they don't really understand what the true potential is, that stage 5 that you've talked about, or that aspirational, what we call compliance 3.0. They don't know what that could look like. They haven't done the calculus in their mind to see oh my gosh, all right, well, if everyone's more engaged here, we're getting more risk intelligence. The quality of the business is going up. Our turnover's lower. Our engagement level's higher. Our bottom line is more. This is absolutely a no-brainer investment. That's the ultimate calculus that they have to do in order to get the full kind of blank check for the ethics and compliance department to, spread their wings a little bit. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think that's where, going back to, it's on us, right? To educate them.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's, how do you not take that approach? You know what I'm saying? How do you give up your agency to some outside force and say, well, I'm not successful because they just don't get it? It's well, it's on you to make them get it. Either right. It's real or it's not real. Either a culture of integrity matters or it doesn't. And if it right. does, and your adversary doesn't understand that, what are you going to do? Just keep freaking emailing him tweets and articles about ethics? I mean, that's not going to do anything. You have to, right. They have to actually, to your point, embrace it if it's ever going to get unlocked. So I loved in your article, you talked about these 3 pillars. Can you talk to us about what those 3 pillars are, and talk to us a little bit about how they can actually implement them, how an organization can actually implement them?
Well, it's really just a reframing of the 7 elements, right? And it's really kind of looking beyond the elements in terms of the concepts that are underneath them. When you apply the 7 elements, and again, it all gets to about how you apply them, they're actually really great at helping to drive organizational behavior. And so what I did with this article was to take the 7 elements and try to understand the concepts behind them, both. And really, when you break it down, it's about aligning expectations, empowering the workforce, and then ensuring that there's accountability and consistency around that in the organization. And to me, those are the things that help you get to a culture of integrity. And it's also just what I've seen in action and in practice. And without those ingredients, you're not going to get where you need to go. You're going to have the check the box compliance program.
I think that's right. I love that approach of getting down to the principles. I think you talked about level 1 or level 2 of being like rules-based compliance. And I would imagine that level 4 or 5 is really about principle-based compliance, which allows us to get out of the confines of the words on the page and do that kind of entrepreneurial thinking that drives sort of innovation. How do you think, innovation is sort of the key for any kind of growth, right? It's like doing something new. Whether that's with your own health or with your company or something like that. So how does ethics and compliance how do ethics and compliance programs like actually drive innovation rather than hinder it, which is what most people think it does?
Yeah. Innovation, as I've come to understand it, not through articles or anything, just my own inherent, is really just improving what exists today, right? And so if you, for example, have some systemic issues that you need to solve, that innovation is getting it to that next level of performance. So I think I just lost track.
No. What you're saying is that innovation is just doing something better. So to the extent that something could be better, there's inherently a problem in there. And to rectify that problem or fix that problem, you have to do something different. And I think what you're saying is maybe at some level, maybe this is what I'm saying, that to the extent that innovation is change and that change is going to come from someone reworking a problem, that has to get out into the world. That has to go from their mind where they're picking that lock or fixing that problem. It has to get out into the world, and that has to change something. It has to change a process or a procedure or something like that. So part of it is about giving people a voice. Part of it is about giving people the freedom to address problems and not feel like overly constricted or constrained by all the rules and red tape and stuff like that.
Exactly.
What else do you think goes into there?
Just knowing who's carrying the ball. I'm not a sports person, but who's got it, and it doesn't mean that there aren't multiple players involved in it, but who's kind of making sure that it happens, whatever it is that needs to happen. And being clear about that and being transparent about it as well. And making, and that leader making it okay to talk about the risks and any concerns that are out there, but also that's the same capability that you need for people to raise ideas and be innovative and bring forward new ways of doing things.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, I like to say that compliance is quality. That's all it is. It's just a high quality organization is going to be a compliant organization. A high quality organization is going to have an ethical culture, right? You're never going to have a high quality organization without those things, I don't think. Because there's so much room in the knowledge work economy for people to make decisions. And we as human beings, we live in the gray and we do good things and bad things and we lie and we tell the truth, right? We all have done bad things. So the potential for bad things to happen is always a non-zero number when there's human beings involved, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think I might have heard this on your podcast, but when somebody says, "Oh, we don't have any problems," that's most probably because people aren't aware and may not understand what might constitute a problem.
Right. Someone recently told me this term, and it's I love it. It's like ethical overconfidence. We're overconfident in our own ethics, either in ourselves or in our company and our team. And I think that overconfidence seems to is correlated with level in the organization. The higher up you are in the organization, the higher the odds are that you're going to be overconfident in the ethical sort of footprint of the company.
Yeah.
You said something earlier in the conversation that I've been trying to get back, or I've wanted to come back to. And you said, the only reason I got involved with this compliance thing is because of the cultural element of it. Was that something that you just sort of saw? Like, did you just already kind of look at the world that way? And if so, why do you think not everybody why doesn't everybody see it? Because I kind of look at the world that way. I see so much potential in it, in unlocking the sort of magic in the human beings that show up at work every single day. What was it that caused you to see that so easily? Is it just the way that you're wired? Is it just, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, a little bit. It's the way that I'm wired. I think culturally too, I come from a very community-oriented culture. But also early in my career, I had experience at a healthcare organization where the department I was in, it was okay to tell racial jokes, right? And that was the first time I had to speak up. And that was scary as heck. And I wasn't able to get resolution. And so I decided to change organizations. And so I went to another organization that was a Medicaid health plan that by design needed to be inclusive. And I suddenly was extremely successful there. And so I realized that the culture can make or break your success, right? And so that, I think that early experience helped me to understand how important culture is.
Yeah. Yeah. You experienced how you how you were kind of withering in one culture and thriving in another culture. You got to really, and that's a feeling that you have.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's so interesting. So as we're getting toward the end here, I would love for you to talk a little bit about your business and where people can find you and how they can get involved with you, with your community, anything like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find me on LinkedIn under Laura Sauber. My website is also sauberconsulting.com, and I'd love to hear from you. My community will be launching in March. It's called Catalyst Her. So if you're an independent consultant in healthcare, please take a look at it when I launch it. It'll come through on LinkedIn. You'll find it.
And also check out the article, It's Time to Reframe Ethics and Compliance Programs by Laura on Medium. It's really phenomenal. Laura, thank you so much for coming on the Ethics Experts. This is a lot of fun. I love the work you're doing. I love your article and just the energy that you bring to this community. And I'm so encouraged for this next chapter because of people like you who are really pushing us forward and, leading the charge. So thank you so much.
It's so great to meet with you, Nick.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.